Okay, welcome back everyone from our break, and we are ready to continue diving deeper into this important work. So Prasanna, thank you again for leading us and teaching us.
Perfect, thanks Naja. Hey everybody, hopefully you had a few minutes to, as Naja said, at least stretch your legs and do what you needed to do before we continue on. Yeah, so before the break, we were talking about the most predictable responses to stress, or even if it's as a result of past experience of trauma, which is fight, flight, freeze. Then we also talked about the function of flocking, and then a couple of folks also talked about fawning, dissociation. We talked about submitting, so on and so forth. So what I'd like to do next is to talk about, again, the physiology of a stress response. So I want to acknowledge that this may be basic for some folks, or you may already know this, with the intention of me going through the content in this manner is to make sure that we all have a common understanding of the basics before we start talking about other complex applications. So when we feel stressed, it's for a number of different reasons, right? So the reason is still going to be an input, if you will, that's received from the brain, and then from there the brain decides, right, does it even want to do anything about it or not? But if it is something that is actually dangerous or could be dangerous, or as someone said this morning, the brain doesn't actually know if it's dangerous or not. It has a fairly well, not fairly, a really, really well established chemical and neurological pathway to get the body up and moving. Right? So the physical pathway is that it activates the adrenal glands, which primarily secretes adrenaline and cortisol. So these are the two compounds, if you will, that then activate other functions. So it's like a domino effect once the brain activates the release of adrenaline and cortisol. So when the when the body has adrenaline and cortisol in it, there are 5 functions that happen almost instantaneously if there's an actual danger. If this is a behavior that this person has experienced multiple times, it may not happen instantaneously, but the outcome is still the same, which is secretion of adrenaline and cortisol, just in case they need to protect themselves. Right? So the 5 functions, the 5 functions have to do with 5 organs or physiological functions, which impacts our lungs, our heart, our liver, and the stomach, and our blood vessels. Right? So what happens is our breathing increases, which makes sense, especially if there is an actual danger. Our heart rate increases, which makes sense if there's an actual danger, so I can run faster, take in more oxygen, so on and so forth. But something else that happens is there is a release or a conversion of carbohydrates or other biological material into sugar to give our body energy to do all these things, right? And similar to the lungs being activated to breathe faster and take in more oxygen, blood pressure increases, and specifically what happens is the walls of the blood vessels become much wider so that the blood can get through it much faster and get reoxygenated. At the same time, the digestive function of our body decreases to the point where I actually may stop for a while. And that's because if you are trying to outrun a tiger or a moose or a person, the body doesn't have a need for digesting food and extracting nutrients, right? Because it's creating its own sugar. So these are great if there is an actual danger. It's not so great if we're in a constant state of arousal or hypervigilance or anticipation of stress, because whether there is a real danger or not, these functions are actively happening, right? So with increased breathing, so that doesn't really cause any long-lasting impacts, but you can see how that could impact your airway. And then socially, people may be wondering why the heck you're breathing so hard or breathing so heavy. Increasing heart rate. So we're talking on a consistent basis. Can absolutely impact your heart health. So the heart is one of the most is one of the strongest muscles in our body, but it's like any part of the body, right? If we use it very often, and in this case at a higher frequency, that muscle will eventually fatigue and or get hurt as well, right? So you may have some damage to the heart as well. In terms of the sugar production, not a problem if I need to run and keep running, but you can see if the body is continuously producing sugar, it doesn't really matter how healthy I eat, because the body then has to do something with that sugar, right? So whether you are eating sugar or not doesn't matter, because your body is continuously producing it. And the challenge is that you don't have an opportunity to expend it, right? So if you're not running and using the energy. For increased blood pressure, same thing. So if there is no real danger, similar to the muscle in the heart, there is a lot of stress on those walls, right? So the walls can take of the blood vessels can take quite a bit of pressure, but not on an ongoing basis. Okay? So then, which is why folks that have high blood pressure as a medical condition have to take steps either from a lifestyle approach or using medication to lower their blood pressure so that their blood vessels aren't being challenged on an ongoing basis. With reduced digestion, so prolonged outcomes could be that I just don't eat because I literally don't feel hungry, which can cause different nutritional and physiological issues from a medical lens. Or the other thing that can happen is that when I do eat, the food doesn't get digested the way it should or at the same rate, which means I may be feeling bloated, sluggish, which again, similar to some of the other physical or medical outcomes, could cause additional challenges for me. So there's lots of other things that happen, but I just want to focus on the main item. Some additional things I want to cover with you folks is the impact of the stress response on our memory and attention. It's our ability to pay attention. So you'll see there it can increase or decrease, and that's totally depending on what the situation is. So in an actual dangerous situation, what can happen to the memory is that it could be hyper-focused in terms of attention, which means obviously you're going to remember that event really well. Right? So the protective factor with that function of hyper-focused, overly focused, and then remembering the event is that, right, we don't have to wait for this event to happen again. We can change our route, we can change our lifestyle, change our job, if we can make all those changes so that we're not in that same situation. And even if we can't change our circumstances, our brain remembers what happened, what could happen, and it'll take steps to avoid it or stay out of harm's way. The way that it could have a diminished or reduced ability to remember or pay attention happens because we need to be hyper-focused, right? So if there's an actual danger, that's great, because at that point I don't really care about if birds are chirping or there's a song on the radio or that there are other people in the environment. I'm just focused on the issue at hand or the danger or the potential danger that's in front of me. Where that can be problematic is in those moments, if I don't know that there is help that I can receive, that there are people around me that are actively trying to support me, because I'm overly focused on my perception of danger or actual danger. So that means is, in a practical application, I guess for you folks, you could be coaching folks, you could be teaching people different strategies, and they actually may not register it at all, or they may not remember it at all as soon as you're done talking to them, because their attention was if you think about it, that example I shared before the break about, right, that parents stop at Prasanna's coming to this meeting, he's a social worker, right? So they obviously went, social worker means bad things can happen or could happen, and then that's what they were focused on. Decreased immune system, similar to a decrease in digestion. So when there is an actual danger, does not make any sense for my body to expend energy or resources to keep me virally safe. But if you think about that on an ongoing basis, you can see how then I'm more prone to catching even things like a cold, infections, or even disease, because my body doesn't have the ability to protect itself from viruses and illnesses. Sensitivity to pain. So the survival function or the protective function of decreased sensitivity to pain is so that our brain doesn't stop to process pain and deal with pain that's superficial, if you will. Right? So as an example, if I said, I like doing windowless camping, so it could be a situation where I hear something in the woods, so I have lots of skills, I know, how to keep myself safe, but if I'm not sure what's in the bushes, or the perception is it's a dangerous animal, or I actually see a dangerous animal or an animal that's now behaving in a dangerous way, and I start running, my brain doesn't necessarily want me stopping to say, ouch, oh, I have a scratch every time I run through a bush or run into a tree or what have you, right? So that's the practical function of reduced sensitivity to pain. So if that's what's happening to me on an ongoing basis, though, hopefully you can see how even cuts and bruises could lead to infections if I don't attend to them, not because I don't want to, but because my brain's just not processing that discomfort or pain. This could also, I'm not saying could also be a reason why some folks who are experiencing lots and lots of stress and or have experienced trauma need heavy doses of physical input. So whether it's motor activity, whether it's very loud or big, or sometimes people say thrill-seeking or risky behaviors, and some folks say to feel alive. And it's not because they want to be in those dangerous or high-risk activities or highly aroused activities, is that they may actually literally may not be able to have a physiological feeling in their body as they're engaged in some low-level activities, if you will. So hopefully that makes sense in terms of how amazing our brain and our body is, unless the brain is now in a consistently stressed state, and then we may have some long-term physical or medical challenges. So earlier on, somebody already talked about positive stress, I think, or the positive aspect of stress. So what I'm gonna invite you folks to do is to think about your own experiences of stress, whether it's in your personal life or professional life, and also the experience of stress for your clients by breaking it down into 3 subcategories. Right? So first is a positive stress. You'll see, based on this description, they're describing it as a brief increase in heart rate, mild elevations in stress hormone levels, so on and so forth. But the main thing is the brain has activated the stress response, right? And what makes it positive is all the examples we talked about earlier about the reasons why we need to have a stress response, right? So early warning system helps us to avert stress or danger, keeps us alive, gets us motivated to do things, so on and so forth. So that's the positive outcome. The other reason it's labeled as positive is because even though an event may be stressful, especially if it's the first time I've experienced it, my brain, whether it wants to or not, learns that, okay, so that was stressful and I'm okay now, right? That was really stressful. I didn't think it was going to end and I'm okay now. So to that, I want to think about what we talked about in terms of the myelin sheath in the for the neurons. And anytime a connection is made, is that even though you as a care provider may know, oh, this is great, Prasanna had a breakthrough, the person may not necessarily see it as a breakthrough, right? Because for them to experience it as a positive stressor, they would have to have that experience multiple times. And another way to think about this category of stress is to think of, so for yourselves, whether it's in your professional lives or personal lives, is to think about a situation where you're stressed. And even though you're stressed, you absolutely have the resources to manage the stress. And if you don't have the resources or skill to manage the stress, you at least have the ability to ask for help from people that can help you, or to look up information so that you can address your stress. So as an example, so I had a little bit of positive stress last night. I told Nadia, yep, I'm going to email you the slides. I'm good to go. I'm excited. Yay. And last night I opened up my slide deck and went, do I have everything down? Am I going to say the right thing? This is the first time I'm presenting to the Nova Scotia College of Social Workers. So I had some positive stress, even though I knew that, you folks are going to be okay, even if I mess up a little bit. Nadia's totally got my back, even from a technological and support lens, so on and so forth. I had that, elevated level of stress, which now that I started talking and I settled into it, and classifying it as a positive stress. For tolerable stress, I want you to think about stressors that aren't necessarily more intense or serious than a positive stress, but the difference is that the activation of the stress response is much longer. And so I want to think about the previous slide where I said, this is where things could get challenging for our physical body and our brain. So here I want you to think about situations where, whether you have the skill set or not, whether you have support from people or not, you're in an elevated level of stress. But what makes it tolerable is that it will absolutely end. Now, when you're thinking about it for yourselves, there may be some situations where you're thinking, but I don't know if it would end. Right? And if your brain doesn't know if it will end, or this is the first time you've come across this stressor, then you may absolutely experience it as a toxic or chronic stressor, right? Until you learn that, oh, okay, well, that ended. I didn't think it was going to end, and it did. Right? And then similar to clients with positive stress, the more often you have this experience, you'll figure out, okay, it's gonna be a week, right? We're short-staffed, or my client has some additional charges laid against them, or my client's caregivers kicked them out of the house, or my client didn't show up for their appointment and they were discharged. And so, anticipating some, challenging work, or, increased workload, if you will, but it will end, right? Because you have experience with doing this type of work. Similar experience with the client or the person you're supporting, especially if they haven't had this experience that I was talking about, or if they're a young person, like a child, teenager, or they require some mental health or cognitive support. So here I want to think about a 2-year-old who we know tantrums much quicker than a 5-year-old, who tantrums much quicker than a 10-year-old, than a 15-year-old, than me. Right? The point is that I will also tantrum depending on what's going on and have a meltdown. But folks that may not have the lived experience or the capacity to think ahead may not be able to keep it together, to stay regulated, if their perception is that this stressor will be here forever. And the last one is toxic or chronic. So here again, similar to tolerable, it's not really about the intensity of the stressor or the type of stressor, but what differentiates this from tolerable is that these are actually situations or circumstances that will not go away from the person, right? Unless, remember, it's a perceptual issue. Right? So here, I want you to think about also what some of those could be. So they could be related to unsafe living situations, it could be relationships, it could be policy practice, it could be systemic issues, it could be global issues that impact everybody. But the difference here is that it's ongoing for the person, whether it's you or the client. And in this description, it says, in the absence of protective relationships. So this is absolutely the case if there aren't any people around to support them or people that they think can support them. But this experience can absolutely happen even if there are lots and lots of people that are readily available to support the person. Right? So it's really about the experience and the circumstances. The last thing I want to say about this part is that the experience of stress and the interpretation of stress can vary even for the same person. Right? So if you think about that example I shared about, okay, this is the first time I'm presenting to the college. So I experienced it as a positive stress only because I know I have a relationship with Naja. Right? Only because I know what the college is all about, only because I'm also a social worker, only because I delivered this information to lots of other people. However, that I guess anticipation or stress of delivering information to a new group could be experienced as tolerable stress even for me, if depending on who the group is, right? Depending on my awareness of who I can reach out to or who's going to be there to support me if I need support, so on and so forth. And then depending on, again, my level of functioning or my experience, I may perceive this or experience this as a toxic or chronic stress. If I'm required to deliver these sessions and don't really have a choice about when I do it or how I do it or to whom I deliver this the training, so on and so forth. I just might want to make the point that the experience or the type of description of the stressor can vary even for a person, and can absolutely vary from person to person. Right? So it could be a situation where somebody's looking at a person in stress or duress and think, well, what's the problem? It's not that big a deal. And you may not say that to the person, but we may think it, which is totally fine because we all have judgmental moments. And when you have those judgmental moments, what I want you to do is think of, okay, is it just that you're frustrated, you're tired, or is it that you haven't really thought about the possibility that it could be a tolerable stress for somebody else, even though it's not a big deal for you, right? Or that it is a toxic or chronic stress for somebody, even though it's not for you, or vice versa. So before we move on, just want to know if there are any questions about this idea of positive, tolerable, and toxic stress.
Again, please feel free to put your questions in the chat. Looks like you have explained it perfectly, Prasanna.
Awesome, awesome. So, yeah, that's to be expected, Rebecca. Yeah. And as I said, it really depends on your own level of function, right? And your ability to tolerate or not be able to tolerate whatever the stressor is. Perfect. So what I'd like to do next is to get you to reflect on your own practice and your work. And so what Nadia's going to do once, we make sure you folks know what you understood the instructions clearly, is to break you off into some breakout rooms. And in your breakout rooms, I want your little group or each of your little groups to talk about the question, right? So some possible causes of stress for your clients for each of these three categories. So we're all gonna, just in the interest of time, because the discussion afterwards is what's important as well, is we're gonna give you about 5 minutes to talk about this. So what I'm gonna invite you to do is, as soon as you go into your breakout rooms, is to generate an example for each category first. Just so you have an ability to kind of think about, okay, do we have one for positive? Do we have one for tolerable? Do we have one for toxic? And then once you have at least one for each category, is to then spend the rest of your time generating as many other examples as you want to.
All right.
And then when you come back, we'll share with each other about what you talked about.
So I'm going to stop recording, but those people who are watching electronically later, this is a chance to pause and generate your own examples.
So thanks so much, Nadia. Welcome back, folks. So hopefully there was just enough time to at least come up with one example per category. So what I'm going to invite you folks to do is to, in the chat, is to put down the examples you talked about for positive stressors, right? So things that you feel are positive stressors that are experienced by your clients. Just those in. Yeah, so just the positive category, please.
Looking good. Some good examples.
Yeah. Still coming in. Yes, I'll start going through these. Yeah, so going to look at a home, having a friend or family member. Yeah, really good example. Encourage them to ask for help. So they're not forcing them to seek help, but even the idea of saying, maybe we should think outside the box could cause stress, absolutely. Yep, pursuing treatment for addiction, job interviews. Right, so returning, yeah, so child's coming home, which is a happy then, yep, some stress around that. Turn a crisis moment into an opportunity for change, yeah, pregnancy, yeah, so even back to the community, paperwork, time crunch, get things going. Applying, yeah, so we have lots of services, but yeah, it's a lengthy application process. Whether the person has language competency needs or not, yeah, it's a lot of paperwork that they need to get their head wrapped around. Okay, anticipating parenthood. Yep. Caregiver burnout. Yep. So their own physiological functioning. So a desire. So I like that. So they are ready. They want to move from a facility to a community setting. Encourage clients to work on skills. Yeah. So even though they're ready, learning new skills. Yeah, absolutely. In relationships, or need an operation. Perfect. Perfect. All right, thanks everybody. So we'll do the same thing now for tolerable stress. Oh, and exams. Yeah, for your, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so now get you to share your examples for tolerable stress, please. You're too efficient. All right, folks. Yeah. So we're still on clients, but so you can share examples of tolerable stress, please. Perfect. Yeah. So shared living with no privacy, minimal privacy. Attending an appointment. So that's a really good example. So even though the appointment may be for good reasons, going to the physical location where the person is could be stressful. And I talked about earlier in the context of flocking or us versus them, is that coming into a location, especially if it's a well-established location, like a hospital or clinic, could be quite stress-inducing. So looking for housing. So let's say they've gone through the hassle of applying, they've filled out all the paperwork, or you supported them, and now, looking for it, waiting for it. Phone call, requesting access, or arranging follow-up appointments for aftercare, or could even be a referral to another service depending on what the needs are. Change, so break in any type of relationship, whether it's friendship or common law. So family conflict. Can they ever do something that loss of wages, or even a reduction in wages. And in terms of the wage example, there also to think about folks that may not have benefits. And so if I have to come see you for myself, or I have to come to you because I'm supporting a loved one, that might mean that I don't get paid for the day, right? Or paid for the time that I'm not at work. So transportation issues. New procedures and protocols. Absolutely. So COVID's been a recent practical or realistic example where I know everybody is like, okay, so what are we doing now? What's the distance? Who can go where? What's happening? But then if you think about, so that's everyone's stress. And on top of that, I'm going to see a social worker. I'm going to see my social worker or to a case conference where a decision could be made or is going to be made to take my child into care, or to have the child come back into my care, or what have you, right? But anytime there's a change in policy procedure, is going to be stressful on an ongoing basis. Perfect. So now let's do the same thing for the last category, which is toxic or chronic. So these would be ongoing stressors experienced by your clients or the people you support. Numerous excessive losses, abusive relationship, toxic workplace, Yep. So addiction, homelessness, any type of insecurity, right? Whether it's food, shelter, job, family violence, yeah, lack of community care, loss of custody. So the last one, I was depending on where you work or the work setting, could also be loss of custody or loss of capacity. So similar to loss of custody, right? There's a reason. So the legal reasons why these awful decisions get made, but for the person, it's what do you mean? I don't have the ability to parent my child. What do you mean? I don't have the ability to make my own decisions and have control of my life. Yeah, so child protection services or living in poverty, absolutely. Yeah, so poverty is a big thing. So yeah, there are again support services, but if they're needing to access some of those services like food banks, shelters, they may not be able to completely come out of the cycle, right? For multiple different reasons. Yeah, toxic workplace, job loss, follow from, yeah. Yep, so yeah, so not just mental health support, but illness-based or a specific illness. Good question. So would toxic be something that you're unable to change or something that's hard to change? So I would say it's both, or it could be both. Um, so the first is unable to change, absolutely. So that makes it toxic or chronic, whether it's because of power differentials or imbalances, position in society, your circumstances, your your inability to fit in with social norms or expectations, so on and so forth. Or the second option you have there is something that's hard to change. So with that, what I want you to think about is the perception, right? Where we might be thinking, you got this, you're going to be okay, and we may see it as a tolerable stress for them, but that may not be their experience at all. The other thing I want you to think about in terms of that idea of harder to change is that until the person actually has lived experience, if you will, or in the brain, there's enough of that fatty tissue, so the myelin sheathing has taken hold, they literally may not believe that this is going to end. Okay? So yeah, so the answer to your question is, yeah, it could be both. Yeah, overcrowding in the home, chronic illness or loss. Perfect. Great. Thanks so much, folks, for having the discussion and sharing your answers. And so what we'll do next is get you folks thinking about the exact same three categories, and then Nadia is going to give you some instructions here again. So now I want you to think about your own experience of stress. And just to keep the conversation focused a little at this point of the session, I'll get you to focus on workplace stressors. Right? So same as before, think about positive stressors, tolerable meaning it will end, toxic meaning ongoing.
All right, so at this point, I will pause our recording so that people from home can write and think about their own sources of stress.
All right, perfect. Thanks, Nadia. Okay, welcome back, folks. Hopefully there was enough time to talk through some workplace examples. Yeah, and I support what Nadia is talking about as well. Is so what I'm doing here is giving you folks a bit of a structure, yeah. So yeah, you can use the time to generate other conversations or yeah, applications, as long as it's related to the specific topic or to build further your learning. So you're thinking about now our own experiences. What are some examples that you folks talked about for positive stressors that we might have in the workplace? Okay, so clear deadlines for expectations, presentations, paperwork, deadlines, time, growth opportunities, technology issues, managing caseload. Okay, yeah, rounds with other professionals. Yeah, absolutely, and not having a permanent position or stability. Yep, working interprofessionally. Yep, so advocacy around caseloads or dealing with the high caseloads in general. Perfect, thanks everybody. So yeah, so similar to the clients. Oh yeah, so meeting new clients. Right, yeah, so you're a social worker, you've got it. You've got that part down, but now you're in a different role or in a different location or organization. Yeah, absolutely, any type of change. You know. Yeah, so similar to the clients, I was going to say is, we could also experience these stressors through, I think somebody already said earlier, multiple times a day, but you could, your experience could change, right? From positive to toxic to tolerable. So but if you think about a consistent experience, what are some examples you folks talked about for tolerable stressors? So things that, cause you to have sustained experience of stress and it will end. So taking a child into care, them within the environment, yep. See kids and manage risks, yep. See them consistently, yep. Day-to-day frustrations, policy practice changes, challenging aggressive conversations with clients.
Couple of COVID. Yeah, that is tolerable, but certainly not short-term stress.
And with COVID, I mean, I specifically said, "Oh, let's focus on work." But again, I'll say it again: your brain doesn't care that you're at work, right? So, all that to say, your personal stressors are absolutely going to be woven in there. But COVID, yeah, affects you in both domains, right? So, okay, yeah, adult protection cases. Some expectations. All right, thanks, folks. Okay, high-risk consultations. Okay, so yeah, so that's very specific. So it's not just the stress of what's a new regulation going to be. Sounds like you have, well, not sounds, you do have an actual experience of, okay, you caught a serious illness. And then, right, and you went on to say that it's because your workplace didn't have as many restrictions or regulations. Yeah, absolutely. Sorry that happened to you. I'm glad you're well enough to be here with us. Great, and then moving on to toxic or chronic. The same thing, if you can share examples you folks talked about. For workplace stressors that are ongoing or will be ongoing. So staying late, and you added every day at work, right? So it's not because there's an emergency or this was an off day or it's a power outage. It's a consistent pattern. Yeah, ethics or ethical dilemmas and moral issues, overburdened systems, walking into unknown environments. Yeah. So with that, it doesn't matter that that's your job and your role. If it is your job and your role is, I want to think about the experience in your brain. Right? So when you're like, right, this is my job, your brain's not going to care about that. It's going to be in the protective mode, wanting you to stay away or be as cautious as possible. And your job may actually require you to, well, be cautious, but still go into those unknown environments. Yeah, so workplace relational issues on supporting managers who have unrealistic expectations. Yeah, and they're not supported. Systemic oppression. Yeah, bias towards youth who are not fitting into box. Absolutely. So that's I like that example because it's not directly affecting you, but it's a chronic stressor because of the work you're doing, right? Which is, I know, is the case for all of us. Yeah, so staff turnaround, systemic challenges, yep, helper fatigue. Right, so increase in demand and expectations without a adequate resources or an increase in resources or support. Yeah, over expectations of your seniors. Yeah, opposition, pushback. Okay, so there's a systemic plan or expectation. And sometimes that could be without any consultation with you, or it could also be situations where the system has engagement sessions and questionnaires, and might be quite thrilled. Finally, I'm going to share my experiences and the needs of my clients, and then the system may still do what it's going to do, or they may not take your feedback into account. Okay, yeah, so lack of socialization in the workplace. Yeah, absolutely. So that interactive relational piece. So we're also pack animals, right? If you think about that idea of flocking, so it's not just about knowing, right, Lynn's at work, which means, okay, good, I don't have to do my think about my clients and Lynn's clients. It's not about that, it's about, right, so do we get to talk to each other as peers, right? And not just for learning purposes, planning purposes, or treatment formulation or planning. Is just to be with each other as human beings and peers. Got it. Yep. Yeah. So that's so I would interpret that as your brain is not happy, and even without your brain, it's not a safe experience at all. And then sounds like you're engaging with the system or supports, and they're not responsive. That's challenging for sure. I'm sorry that's happening for you. Oh, I see what you mean, Lynn. Yeah. Oh, got it. So institutional, yeah. Okay, so some light, still, a few weeks away, but there's some
New
hope.
jobs can provide positive stress and hope for those of us stuck in jobs that feel unsafe.
Yeah, and then also, I mean, may not really, give you a sense of safety, but knowing that you have a support group outside of your family and friends with other social workers, if you are. Right? So I'm sure you already knew that, but thinking about the college, not just, so the college has a very specific function and a purpose, but one of the many functions and purposes of the college is to keep us connected, right? So not just through learning events like this, but through other events. And as I said, it may not be helpful in the moment, but to at least know, right, there are other folks I can at least seek out or speak with, could make your brain have some sense of relief.
Yeah, and I do want to just jump on that again. So our social justice committee in our college has an advocacy arm. And if you are encountering sources of toxic stress based on injustice, please feel free to reach out to us. Many of you do already, but while we are not a union, we want to support you in whatever way we can, and we are here to assist you in connecting with resources. So know that, in fact, follow up with me as your professional practice and advocacy consultant, and I will see what we can do to support you. You're not alone.
So thanks so much for sharing those examples, folks. And so, so this concept of, positive, tolerable, toxic may not be new to some of you folks, but one of the many reasons that the literature or the work in this area recommends that we start to categorize what type of stress we are experiencing, and then also project to, I wonder what type of stress the client is experiencing, is to help our brain figure out, right, what do we do about it, right? Is this something that I can wait out till the weekend? Is this something I can wait out until my coworker comes back onto the floor, or until I get instruction or get an answer from a supervisor? Or is it a situation where it could be ongoing, or it is ongoing, and then that may help you to make a decision about, right, am I okay to stay in this state of stress? And that could be the case. So I know I've definitely stayed in highly stressful environments because I chose to stay there. And that's what this is about, is it's giving you choice about, right, do I even want to do something about it, or not? And to help you figure out what your next steps are, whether it's to manage the stress or to make a more permanent or serious decision as well. So that's a starting point. And the next thing I want to get into then is, we're still with this idea of what is the neurobiological process, whether it's for us or the client, is to also think about, how we may be processing information if it's not our brainstem making decisions for us. Right? So here on the slides I've got, again, he's from Bruce Perry. He has a framework called state-dependent functioning, and I'm a big Bruce Perry fan. That doesn't mean that they're the only resource, but one of the many reasons I like this framework is because it breaks it down into 4 categories, even though we know the brain doesn't just have 4 specific areas or basic areas, which allowed me anyways to get a handle on, right, so this is why I feel this way, this is why my body is doing this, which in turn helped me to do my job better as I was supporting clients. So I won't go through the whole thing in a lot of detail, but just to orient you to the content. On the first column where it says mental state, what they're actually talking about is the physiological experience in your body when each of these basic areas of the brain are activated. Cognition, which is the third column, is talking about how we process information. when we're at each of these basic levels of arousal. And for functional IQ, it's basically a guide based on the functional IQ of an average person that just shows how you can use this information to your advantage if you happen to have access to a psychoeducational report or other information. Right? The last column is not essential, but the first three could be quite helpful. So for cortex, remember, cortex is the biggest part of the brain, area of the brain. And then remember, for the cortex, as I said, the very front of the brain, called the prefrontal cortex, doesn't completely mature. So it's physically all there and fully functional, but doesn't mature till we're about 24 to 30 years of age. And so what I want you to think about there is that when we are able to have access to our cortex and the prefrontal cortex, our brains are in a calm state, which means our bodies are in a calm state. And that's because there's no need for the brain to release adrenaline and cortisol into the system. And when our brain is happy and our body is calm, for cognition, you'll see that's why it says abstract and reflective, because that's when we can do all those cool human functions, right? Like recall information, manipulate information, project information to what could it look like 5 minutes from now, 5 years from now, reflective thinking, all those types of functions can happen when we have access to the prefrontal cortex and or the cortex. And for alerts, remember, it's the body or the brain's experience. So for alert, it could be a situation where the brain has received some information and it's in the process of establishing, is this going to kill me? Could this kill me? Is this going to harm me? Will it harm, or could it harm me? And if it's no, 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 it guaranteed the next decision point is, am I safe, right? So it could be psychologically safe, it could be around belonging, being accepted, all those types of more complex functions. And so for most human beings, what this could feel like in their body could be a warm body, right? So not quite sweaty, but warm. You might get a little fidgety. You may be a little distracted. And the other thing I tell folks is you may be engaging in activity that you would describe as a habit, right? So I'm a pretty active person, and so my legs usually bouncing around. I say, oh, I always bounce my leg, and that could be the case. And as I've kind of really started to apply this content to myself, what I've noticed is that when I'm actually in a calm state, may not be as physically calm as some other people, but I definitely have an increase in my physical behaviors when I'm in this alert state. For cognition, here they're saying concrete and routine. So you want to think about what I just said, which is habits, right? Whether it's bouncing a leg, clicking a pen, looking around, so on and so forth. But the practical function, when they're talking about concrete routine, is that your brain is defaulting to behaviors or resources that it absolutely knows has worked in the past, right? So at that point, it doesn't matter how intelligent I am or how many skills I am, my brain is going to make me do things that I may not typically do, right? So in a professional setting, that could be, saying a statement like, so I'm not in agreement. I know this is a team decision. I just want everyone to know that I still don't agree. So you're still, you're telling people that you're unhappy, but you're not really getting up and leaving, and you're definitely not sitting there and letting the other folks know that you're in agreement. Or it could also be a situation where, based on some of the examples you folks actually shared, where it could be an unsafe situation, or it is an unsafe situation, that your brain, in conjunction with your professional training and the cortex, could be going into the protective mode, but not going into the client's home, right? Or leaving a client's home before things get too dysregulated or escalated. or you may even refuse to do a visit based on your past experience. And that's because your brain's not wanting you to be there. Now, for your clients, it's absolutely the same thing as well. And whether it's clients or as if you think about human behavior, this is also typically where human beings, as they default to sometimes inappropriate or even unprofessional behaviors, right? So like raising their voice, yelling, could even be swearing, could be really demanding, could be banging your fist on the table, slamming doors, throwing things, and could be intentionally, the person could be intentionally doing those things to try and scare the other person so they get their way, which is an awesome way to get your needs met. But the point I want to make is that the person may actually not have any awareness of the fact that they're talking loud, talking fast, yelling, swearing, showing dangerous behaviors, so on and so forth. From there, where they're talking about alarm, so remember this is the body's experience. So here I want you to think fight, flight, freeze. Okay? So most people think the last stage is where we experience fight, flight, freeze. But it's a more intense version, if you will. But for alarm, I want you to think about those behaviors that human beings engage in, whether it's professionals or clients, where they're not really in control. They may have some access to that cortex, which tells them, okay, they may have some choice or help them to make some decisions consciously. But majority of the time for human beings, they're on a bit of an autopilot mode, if you will, and unable to accept help and support, right? If it's in unsafe or dangerous situations, which is the same thing for us as well. And then for fear, it's not the feeling of fear, but it's the experience of fear from your brain stem. And for fear, I want you to think about your brain stem thinks or is convinced that your body is going to experience significant physical harm and or death. So at that point, even though it's a bit of an autopilot for cognition, they're describing it as reactive and reflexive, because you may actually not have any awareness at all about what your body is doing, because your brain's doing taking over the decision-making ability for you. So earlier on, we talked about, somebody brought up the example of dissociative. So this is typically where you might see some of that behavior, where they're walking, running, doing motor actions, but their brain is not actually able to receive any information. And the ultimate fear-based response would be things like, actually fainting, which is a full shutdown of the brain. Could be things like, doing some really dangerous things like jumping out of buildings, breaking things, not because they want to, but because they want to get through something, so on and so forth. And this is also typically the stage of activation in a person's brain where they may have memory loss or inability to recall what happened. So you may have some clients that say, I didn't do that, or I would never do that. You know me, person, I would never do that. And then I may have seen the whole thing and gone, oh, you did it. And it's not that they're lying. I mean, they could be that if their brain has been activated to this level, it's that they actually don't have any memory of what they did. There's also where, so in that stress response slide, I talked about digestion decreasing or halting, and then, all the other increases. But at this stage, so I already talked about fainting, but this also be a state of activation where folks may lose the ability to control their bowels, they may vomit, so on and so forth, because the body doesn't have a reason to hold on to some of those functions if it's literally trying to stay alive. So hopefully that makes sense in terms of what could be happening in the brain based on what's going on for the person around them. So for functional IQ, as I said, you may not have easy access to their health record or mental health record in the moment, but if you do have a job where you have the ability to look at a person's health record or mental health record before they seek services from you, and they have previous assessments, you could use their IQ, cognitive functioning, or functional IQ as a starting point. So for example, here you'll see the numbers start at about 100 to 120. And by the time it gets to brainstem, it's basically halved. So if this is my brain, it doesn't mean that when my brain's functioning in this fear state that all of a sudden I've become less intelligent. It just means that I don't have the ability to recall information and function the way I could or I want to, as if I was in this calm or baseline level. So what that means is if you are working with the adult my age and their starting number is much less than 100 to 120, then what the science tells us is that when the person gets upset, dysregulated, stressed, they're going to show some of these behaviors in the alarm and fear state much faster and much quicker, which is makes sense in terms of an example or a statement I made earlier about the reason why we know 2-year-olds melt up much faster than 5-year-olds, 5-year-olds quicker than 10-year-olds, so on and so forth, because they don't have the ability or the capacity to keep themselves regulated. Another model that's used quite often in this work is referred to as the window of tolerance framework. So you'll see less of this state-dependent functioning and more reference to window of tolerance framework. But they're talking about the exact same thing, right? It's giving us a bit of insight into that experience in the brain versus what you can see and hear from the client, or insight to what's happening in your brain, even for you as a care provider. So the idea here is you'll see the 2 dotted lines in the middle where it says window of tolerance. So that's the ideal state of functioning for all human beings, if you will. So similar to that calm state, in state-dependent function, you'll see so grounded, able to emotionally self-regulate or self-regulate, period. Being open and curious, flexible, being present. So I described it as all those wonderful complex behaviors in the previous slide. And if you go to the top of that graphic where it says hyper aroused, I want you to think about those behaviors that we may be easily be able to see in a person, right? So things like they're moving around, they're unable to sit still. It's not just the leg bouncing, but now they might actually be moving around. They may be angry. So in the previous slide, I said they could be raising their voice, overwhelmed, or they're unable to manage their emotions or stay regulated, even though you know they have the skills, or you know that they know that you're in the presence, but they're still unable to seek support from you. And then here they're talking about fight, flight, freeze, because in this framework, it's in the hyper aroused end of the continuum where you'll see those physically activated behaviors, right? So that would be fight and flight. And then on the hypo-aroused, you'll see, so this will be on the freeze end, depending on how serious the reaction is. So you're talking about shutting down. So I also said, a full faint could happen here as well. But then some other complex behaviors are so numbing, withdrawn, be isolating, being passive. Earlier on, remember we talked about fawn, so that could be happening here as well. And you'll see depression. So it doesn't mean that if you have, the DSM description of depression that you're always in a hyper-aroused state. But this is, if you're thinking about a medical model, that's why they put depression in the hypo-aroused based on the diagnostic criteria for depression. And then, so even with this, what we know is, so the yellow lines there in the middle is that, so I know I go up and down, right, between all 3 stages. And for me, depending on what the input is or what the experience is or what's in the environment, will absolutely influence whether I go into the hyper aroused state or the hypo aroused state. All right, so just want to pause here. I realized after the last breakout group activity, I've been chatting for a while. So, sorry, my timer. I just want to pause and see if anyone has any questions or comments about anything I've shared.
Again, please feel free to put your comments in the chat. Sounds like you are being very clear, Prasanna.
Perfect. But I mentioned these, I've mentioned these names before as well. So Dan Siegel is the originator, so he's a psychiatrist that introduced this idea of window tolerance, but then since then, there's been lots of other folks that have added to that content over the last several years as well. All right, so okay, comments coming in. So yes, well, I'm gonna assume yes. Nadia, am I able to send these to you and you'll share the slides?
Yeah, so we will be sending out a survey on your experiences of our session. Of course, we are still just in the new stage of offering online education. We welcome your feedback and we can send out the slides as well to you all. That's again one of those awesome things that you get by signing up to join our program as opposed to watching the video later. And yeah, I see the comment about helping us reflect on our own experiences as well as helping our clients. And that capacity to integrate self with our work is key to not only effective work, but reducing burnout. So yeah, thank you, Prasanna. Sounds good.
Welcome. All right, folks. So that brings us to the end of what I see as the first of 3 core objectives, which is to explore or think about the neurobiology of behavior. And that we're going to be doing next is going into looking at resilience. So again, motor neurobiology is for clients as well as for us. Before we get into trauma-informed practice. So thinking about resilience, so I feel we're pretty lucky in Nova Scotia to have Michael Unger, who has an actual lab. He's internationally linked in and doing ongoing work and research. So there, we have ready access to some pretty awesome information. I mean, we could still access the information, but it's pretty cool that we have somebody in Nova Scotia that's doing a specific work and ongoing work around resilience. So in terms of descriptions, Michael Unger and lots of others as well explain it in terms of individual and collective or social resilience. For individual, they describe being as resilience is generally understood to be an individual's ability to overcome adversity and continue their normal development. So when you're thinking about that, what I want you to do is think of, how you yourself may understand or explain resilience or the idea of resiliency to somebody else. Okay, so to do that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to pop up a couple of pictures. And in the chat, what I'd like you to do is to tell me which one of these 2 plans you think is more resilient or is resilient. You think one is resilient versus the other, or is one plan more resilient than the other? So you can describe it as green or yellow, or leaves and flowers.
So in the chat, please vote green or yellow. I'm very interested to see what people are going to say. So interesting.
Mm-hmm. Looks like yellow's winning.
Yeah, I don't see any green. I'm also curious as to why people are seeing that. I see several people saying both, lots of people saying yellow. I have not seen anyone saying green. So, okay.
So I was gonna, yellow has no water, which is required for growth. Oh. Thanks, Lynn. So I was actually gonna propose or ask the same question.
Yeah, trying to explain.
Yeah, what your rationale, and if it was just a guess, that's totally fine as well. But if you had a thought process, I'm curious to know why you picked one versus the other, or said yellow versus both. Lynn's already offered water. Any other reasons why you picked your answer? Okay, it's more beautiful in hardship, but green looks like, yeah, hardy and resilient. Yeah, Kelly, yeah, so they're both growing under adverse conditions.
All right, so some very different theories about why, both growing out of resilient conditions. Most saying yellow. I would have thought green, and someone else just said green over yellow because the growth is more difficult, but making progress towards growth. I would have said green because I feel like the petals on the yellow are more delicate. They're more beautiful, and it's more amazing that it thrived, but they're more delicate. So I worry about its long-term resilience. But that's just me. I'm really curious, Prasanna, what your thoughts are.
Interesting. So this is initially when I started doing these sections on my own. Feel like yellow, we're looking. Okay, again, different perspective. Yellow, we're looking at versus looking down on. Yeah,
that's a really interesting perspective.
Yeah. Yeah, so when I initially started doing these sessions on my own, I just, came up with the idea to generate a discussion, and it's amazing where this conversation goes and all the different reasons why people pick one or the other, or say, well, both, it doesn't matter. But the reason I want to put the question out there is just to make the point that resiliency or resilience is first and foremost, if you think connection to the neuroscience again, is about being alive, period. That's where it ends, right? If you're alive and your brain has figured out how to stay alive, that's resilient. Right? And then from there is to then think about, okay, what else is this person's brain, or what else is this person now consciously doing to help themselves, or what are they consciously doing to help themselves so that they're not in that survival mode all the time. And the reason I started talking about that is because there appeared to, not always and not all groups, there appeared to be this opinion well, socially for sure, that resilience means I have experiences of toxic stress or ongoing stress or even big T trauma experiences, and now I'm a social worker, right? Or I have all these adverse experiences and now I'm wealthy. So it was associated with social position, power, so on and so forth. And if you think about it, you do need certain skills and to even be able to navigate society, to go to school and become a social worker or to build wealth or what have you. But the point I want to make is that just doing whatever you need to do as needed is also resiliency. Right? And the reason I say this at this point is to make the connection that and the conversation we'll have after lunch about what are some maladaptive, unsafe, or illegal behaviors that your clients or even we may be engaged in, that so legally it's not okay, socially is not okay, professionally is not okay, And then I'll go back to my phrase that I've said a few times today, which is your brain doesn't care, right? Your brain's making you engage in that behavior or having that response because it's worked for it in the past. Absolutely, yeah. Thanks, Kelly, for that additional comment as well. And then the last thing, the next thing I want to talk about, I mean, there's, lots of things we can do intentionally to help people build their resiliency, which may be part of your job description. You might not say build resiliency in your clients, but we know that, part of our job as a helping professional, whether as a social worker or not, is to help people, right? Figure out different strategies, support people to maintain coping strategies that are working for them. And if it's not the safest, most appropriate or legal, then offer different strategies. And then when you're thinking about the application of individual resilience to us, is to also not think less of ourselves if we're not as successful, right? Or not to think less of ourselves even within the profession of social work or in your workplace if you're not allowed to or you can't do certain things that other people are allowed to do, or it's not in your job description or role or what have you. But it's to celebrate your profession, celebrate the skill set, even if you can't perform your duties to the way that you want to perform those duties. And whether it's supporting our clients or for ourselves, so that last picture on the bottom is there to give me to talk about the fact that when we are in adverse situations, like our clients are or could be, or we ourselves could be, or if you think back to the conversation we had about tolerable and toxic stressors, that's sometimes being resistive to change or being resistive to whatever or whoever is causing us harm could cause us more injury. So at this point, I want you to think back to the fight, flight, freeze conversation we had a while back at this point, where we talked about fawning, right? So keeping people happy. So it could be a situation where you're like, I don't care for this person, I don't care for the supervisor, and I'm still gonna laugh at their jokes. I'm still gonna go along with their ideas because there is a benefit or a gain to me. And then the other idea is, just kind of figure out how to weather the storm, if you will, or roll with the punches, depending on how you want to describe it. Even though, you're getting hurt or harmed in the moment, you're able to think ahead. Right? So that's, I can think about that in terms of fawning. I can think of that in terms of submitting, depending on what the circumstances. Because we know this happens, right? So not even in the context of resiliency, but as a survival mechanism, there are lots and lots of reasons why folks sometimes choose consciously, unconsciously to stay in unsafe environments or circumstances. All right. So I'm looking at the time. We have about 2 minutes before we break for lunch. So before we do that, I want to know if there are any questions or comments about resilience resilience as it relates to individuals, whether it's an individual client or yourself.
It looks like we are all still eager to continue learning.
So we'll hand it over to Nadia here in a minute, but what we're going to do when we come back from lunch, a break, I'll let you decide what you want to do with your hour, is to start with collective resilience, and then we'll continue on.
Awesome. Thank you, everyone.